Thank you for joining us again and welcome back to our channel. If you are joining us for the first time, we want to thank you for watching. In today's episode, I will be diving into the reason why the United States of America and its allies still fail to diagnose the strategic relationship that Russia has in the continent of Africa, including China. We do have an analyst that's going to be helping us with regards to breaking it down as to the reason why Washington still don't understand how to figure out the geopolitical strategic issues in the continent of Africa. So without any more delay, let's just dive straight into it. Some global experts will argue that the United States has lost focus in the continent of Africa. A lot of narratives with regards to Russia and China has clouded the American perspective in the region. Most experts still argue that the US has not lost it all. However, this is how I see it as an analyst. The United States recognizes Africa's strategic significance, but its influence on the continent of Africa may be compromised as a result of the constant discussion with regards to Russia and China. What the continent of African people do not hear from the United States is why the United States offer an alternative and what the US is doing on the ground. The US has not been able to sell its achievement in the continent of Africa. If you listen to geopolitical analysts, Russia speaks less, China speaks less, they carry out action. But the United States of America is everywhere, all over the place, talking about a geopolitical foes. In this episode, we do have an analyst that's going to be looking into it, and we will dive into the video.
Right, so I just pulled up some data on exports and imports of goods. So this doesn't include services. Russia imports about $2 billion. Well, the last data was from 2020. $2 billion worth of goods in 2020, right? China was about 56. This is just goods. So it's a little bit bigger when you add services, but it still gives you a sense of the differences, right? US was 20 billion. So US is also, far behind. China, for most of these countries, is by far the biggest trading partner. But, 2 billion, 20 billion, 56 billion, you can see like Russia is a fraction, right, of the others. So why, and as Joe was saying, actually the trading relationship has declined over the years. Much of what Russia has to offer, Russia doesn't really have that much to offer, right? Much of what African countries get from Russia is arms, right? So that begs the question, why, despite the small trading relationship, despite the sort of lack of any real kind of big offerings, what's in it for African countries? Like, why have we seen sort of some disparity in the votes at the UN around the Russia-Ukraine war and so on and so on? So, a few perspectives on that from the African perspective. One is historical. And I don't want to overplay this, but it's important. In the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, when a lot of, especially Southern African countries, were fighting for liberation, and if you think about South Africa, especially, which a lot of people have been thinking about because of the BRICS summit, white minority rule apartheid, the only country that helped in the ways that it mattered, right, for the now ANC, then rebel group that was fighting for multiracial democracy was the Soviet Union, right? They helped with guns, with training, with money. In places like Angola and Mozambique, when there was a famine, they poured millions, billions of dollars to help prevent starvation. And the US was supporting and financing white minority-led oppressive governments in those places, okay? And not only did they finance and support those governments, they did it right up until when it was, right up until very sort of late in the history. They were on the wrong side of history for a very long time, okay? And so that has brought a lot of goodwill from a lot of people who are leaders in those countries, right? The current leaders in the African National Congress in South Africa remember, right, when they were young, that the support from Soviet Union probably prevented, deaths and so on and so forth. Okay, so it's about a lot of, now, but I think it's important to remember, like, that doesn't mean, but I would even say that that influence now is declining, right? Because these guys are old, and they're eventually, the people who are coming of age in South Africa don't remember, they don't care. But it gives you some context into, you know, why some of these relationships exist.
In the nutshell, Africa's strategic importance is set to increase. The United States of America's aim to counter China and Russia influence will backfire. African countries will likely engage with all sides. As Cold War trends emerges, Africa has become a key stage for strategic competition between actors with varying and also sometimes irreconcilable interests. The geopolitical relevance of the continent of Africa is set to increase dramatically. Its population is booming, and its mineral resources will be in high demand for the green energy transition. More importantly, the African bloc looks poised to play a determining role in multilateral institutions, as all we've seen with regards to Russia's vote in the United Nations General Assembly. However, the political landscape has significantly changed since the second half of the 20th century. African countries are now better equipped to reap the benefits of systemic competition in the continent of Africa and around the world.
The second is countries are starved of capital, right? In most African countries, their biggest challenge is financing. Okay, and if you're starved of capital, what you want strategically in your foreign policy is to give yourselves as many options as possible. You want variety of partnerships. Okay, so it's not necessarily like, okay, what are they offering? It's, I don't want to box myself into one corner. And mind you, my most important trading relationship is China. And China has a strategically close relationship with Russia. The friend of my friend is my friend, or at least the friend of my friend is not my enemy, right? So you want to keep those doors open and keep yourself flexible. Now, the other thing that I would say that I think often gets lost in the conversation when we talk about, you know, whether and how Russia's actions in Africa are destabilizing. I think the tendency in the US and from a US audience is to say, you know, and this has been happening a lot with China, let me explain to you why this is bad. Let me explain to you why you should not associate with XYZ, okay? The trading, you know, trading relationship, partnerships, whatever it is, like they're not hiring Wagner or going to the Africa Summit because they don't understand the risks, right? They're grown adults. They know exactly what they're doing. They don't, you know, but they're doing it, and in part, even where there are negative effects, like with Wagner, it's because of the lack of institutional capacity. It's because of the lack of state capacity. It's because of the state of, you know, strength of political institutions. And so I often say what I want US policy to do is to focus on how do we strengthen those things so that we don't have the incentives to do it. Not to say don't do it, because what's the point of you telling me don't do it? I know it's bad. I'm doing it because I can get away with it, right? And also think about how, like, you know, we, from an African perspective, we know, you know, there's so many non-Russian Western firms that do the same things. Glencore, if you just Google Glencore in DRC, right? Glencore in DRC, you know, paid lots of bribes, lots of shady, murky deals to do lots of stuff that was not in DRC's interest. Like, the difference is that Glencore comes from a country, a state, where it's more likely to be held accountable for those things, right? Wagner doesn't. But will any other company in any other Western state do the same things if they could get away with it? Yes, and they have. The French in West Africa do the same thing, sorry, all the time. You know, if it's very controversial, the French in West Africa, very corrupt, murky deals, state to state. Again, the risk appetite is a little bit higher in France versus the US. You're more likely to get, you know, shamed in the US. So the point I'm making is human nature and the Latin greed and all of that is the same. What we need to do is focus on how do we strengthen those political institutions. I think that often comes from improving the ability to raise revenue, improving financing, improving capital, investing in the things that make economies competitive, right? not necessarily just the trade, not necessarily the like human rights, democracy, but also like financing the bridge, financing the, those things that would then help improve capacity. So that's sort of my little advice, I guess, on U.S. foreign policy, and I'll stop there, and we can.
If you look at the United States of America strategy for Africa, Africa has never been a priority for the American policymakers, while the Biden administration is no exception. The United States of America's 2020 strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa clearly recognizes the relevance of the continent within the current fragmented world order. The document highlighted three important figures. Africa will account for 15% of the world's population by 2050. It holds 30% of the world's reserves of critical minerals, and it makes up 28% of the United Nations voting groups. But the rationale for the United States of America's engagement in the region is also based on the need to counteract expanding influence of other actors, namely China and also Russia. If you look at different strategic options, in recent decades, the United States of America's policy for Africa has been determined and also mostly by security concern. Washington has maintained a strong security footprint on the continent of Africa, including a permanent military base in Djibouti and also a drone base in Agadez in the country of Niger. It also has several military facilities in East Africa, with Africa and also the Sahel region, where it plays a critical and albeit discrete role in surveillance in the region. When compared with other actors like the European Union or China, the United States of America approach has been characterized by trade and investment rather than development, assistance or loan. Instead of broad agendas, Washington relies on specific programs like the 2000 African Growth and Opportunity Act, also the 2003 President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and the 2013 Power African Initiatives, or more recently Prosper African Initiative, designed by the Trump administration. The new security reaffirms declaration from 2017 when National Security Strategy named China and Russia as actor, attempting to erode American security and prosperity. The document states that U.S. rivalry are employing non-military tools to advance their influence and also interest on the continent of Africa. Let's listen to what these analysts have to say, and we will close the videos in the next few minutes.
I am one of those people who thinks all the summits are symbolic. Any Africa, anything summit is always symbolic. Africa, US, Africa, China, Africa, whatever.
Then why do they all show up?
Good question, right? Because they're at the bottom of the food chain, right? But it's all, for Russia, just like it is for the US and China, it's about projecting influence, right? So I think, but, why do they go? Obviously they'll go to the US Africa Summit because it's the US, right? Like leader of the free world, you don't want to piss them off. For Russia, I think it's a mix of things, right? I don't agree. I mean, I don't think it's, I think majority of African governments, at least the ones that matter, where most Africans live, South Africa, Angola, Nigeria, they're not authoritarian, right? And I don't think that that's kind of an attractive model at all, right? Even if you poll Africans, most Africans want to live in a democracy, and that's where the continent is headed. It's actually pretty entrenched, I think, right now. The outliers, the places where we're seeing a regression are small. They're outliers, and they're frankly just not that important even in African geopolitics. So I don't think that's like the driver really into attraction to the model. I think it's about not wanting to close any doors. I think it's about China. China is an important factor. Don't underestimate China, right? China is an important partner for many countries, regardless of the size, and so you don't want to piss off China, okay? And I think it's hard. Don't also underestimate the small arms. Like a lot of these countries are facing serious security challenges, and it's extremely expensive to buy arms from the US or any industrialized country. And low cost, effective arms, Russia does that well, right? And so often a lot of what comes out of these deals is like security arms deals. Back to your question about what's sort of informing the more lukewarm reaction on the African continent about the Ukraine war. It's a mix of things, right? But I think one of the things is this, most African countries condemn the invasion, but they still don't like the moral high ground. This idea of like, you're either with us or against us, and like this is this moral kind of fight for democracy and whatever, that's what people cringe at, right? That's what people don't like. Because I mean, remember, look, most of this, when we talk about, we forget sometimes that a lot of the security challenges that the Sahel is facing was caused in part by the bombing of Libya, right? Which nobody consulted, a lot of African head of states was nobody consulted us on that, right? This is the challenge that we're facing. But you want us to like jump up and like, you know, fight your war on this moral, you know. So I think it's really more about most African countries, if you're at the bottom of the food chain, the worst thing you want is some precedent that anybody can go invade can invade some poorer country, right? So at least on principle, people condemn that. But I think it's the idea that like this is like a moral conscience thing, and like it's black and white, and you know we must of course be clear, and I think that's what people cringe at. So that's why it's a little bit mixed.
Thank you.
As we close this episode, the United States of America's strategy for sub-Saharan Africa has become much more comprehensive and now includes 4 far-reaching goals. The first is fostering openness and open society in accordance with international liberal world order led by the United States of America. The second is to deliver democratic and security dividends based on the idea that democracy is exportable through positive inducement and punitive measures such as sanctions. The third is to advance pandemic recovery and economic opportunities. Finally, the fourth target is to support conservation, climate adaptation, and a just energy transition. However, African countries are beginning to charter a new part in their history. They're beginning to make some very important decisions, and they also want to take absolute control in their own future in whatever way or shape or form. I believe that African partners in Europe, the United States of America, and Asia have accepted that Africa has emerged, and they're beginning to make some strategic decision of their own. However, the continent is open for business in working with other countries and partners that are ready to also do that investment. However, Africa also is part of the global community, and they're beginning to make some strategic choices for their own people and for their future. We want to thank you for watching. If you are new to this channel, we encourage you to subscribe. Check some of our informative videos on our YouTube channel to broaden your geopolitical knowledge in regards to how Africa interacts with the global community. For now, we want to thank you for watching. We are looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.